Let's get cracking with tonight's program. And I see Ajahn Titanan has made it, but I don't know whether he's actually ready to take the stage yet. Gwen, can we get our speakers up on stage? You all right, Jay? Wicked. All right. Look, let's get up. We'll get our speakers on stage. But we have, as you can see on the screen, the author Sebastian Strangeau, who's spoken at the club a couple of times before and given us a very original and provocative take on Cambodia, which he knows very well, in particular on the conventional view that there was a project to build democracy in Cambodia that somehow tragically failed because of Hun Sen, and his critique of the kind of Western view of Cambodia's history is very strong and really very, very provocative for all of us. He's now expanded that to look at the relationship between this region, Southeast Asia, and China. Not the first person to do it, but it is a subject of such enormous importance, and with so many dimensions. It is very hard for any book to get across the whole of the panorama of Chinese-ASEAN relations, and this book does as well as any I've come across in giving you a fantastic grip of the issues and the ambiguities too. The great questions: is China bent on a kind of great power domination of the region, or is this a sort of pragmatic expansion of its own interests and everything done on a contractual basis? Where does superpower rivalry with the United States fit in? All of that is in Sebastian's book. So I'm going to actually ask Sebastian, first of all, as we've got you up from Australia, to give us an outline, first of all. And I think what I'd actually like to ask you to do is, given that we've had a lot of other books that have looked at this relationship between China and ASEAN, what you discovered in your research that is new and illuminating about that relationship.
First off, thank you so much for hosting me tonight. Ever since I submitted the manuscript for this book, I've been looking forward to coming to the FCCT to launch it. Unfortunately, I had to leave Thailand in March due to COVID-19, and I sort of got stranded over here in Australia and ended up relocating back home. So it'll be a while before I'm back in Bangkok. But thankfully, technology allows us to beam in this way, and I'm very happy to be here. So yes, I haven't read a lot of the other books that have come out. I've been so busy sort of plugging this one and dealing with my day job. So it's a little bit difficult for me to say where mine differs. But I think you're right in saying that this is an incredibly complex topic, which one book cannot really ever really hope to do full justice to. I mean, every chapter that I wrote in this book, and I go through each nation one at a time, more or less, could have been a book in itself. I mean, the complexity of each nation's relationship with China and the deep history that each brings that has sort of inflected its approach towards China in the present day, is a very, very difficult thing. And I had several moments during the research and writing of this book where I began to wonder if maybe I'd bitten off a little bit more than I could chew by taking this topic on. So unwieldy was it at certain points. I probably left on the cutting room floor about 50% again of text that wasn't able to make it into the book, or was, that didn't quite fit. Do you want me to go straight into my overview of the book and its main themes, or should we wait for the panelists?
I think actually would be helpful, because I guess that most of our audience haven't had a chance to look at the book yet, so I think that'll be very useful. Okay.
Well, so this book really has its roots in the time that I spent in Cambodia as a journalist. As you mentioned before, I've done a lot of work there, and I spent 8 years in total, 2008 to 2016, living and working in Phnom Penh and covering the nation's politics quite closely. And of course, one of the big stories during the time that I was in Cambodia was this sort of the meteoric rise of Chinese influence. During the time that I was in the country, China became Cambodia's number one trade partner, its number one source of foreign investment, its number one source of tourists, and an increasingly important diplomatic backer of the government of Prime Minister Hun Sen. But of course, there's another, it was interesting as well in another way, and that you sort of alluded to this in your introduction, Jonathan, which is that, there was this concerted effort at the start of the 1990s to sort of turn Cambodia into a liberal democracy. And that project reflected to some extent the general optimism about where the world was going in the early 90s. At the end of the Cold War, there was a sense that the world was moving towards a sort of more democratic, everything was going to sort of converge towards a model of liberal democracy. And Cambodia became, it reflected very strongly that, that sense, that zeitgeist. Flash forward nearly 30 years, and what we see is something quite different. And I think that, China's rising power has sort of, in some ways, brought that period to an end. And watching this from the ground in Cambodia, I became aware that this was the country's evolution reflected a broader trend that we were seeing across the region and across the world. And so I began to be interested in how this was playing out in other countries. And so, a lot of my reporting, I began to sort of gear it towards examining the China question wherever I happen to be in Southeast Asia. I found overall that, Southeast Asia's perspective of China is really deeply fraught and anguished. And on the one hand, the lure of economic opportunity of hitching yourself to the freight train of Chinese economy is an incredibly, a powerful lure. But this coexists with a great deal of fear and trepidation about what a powerful China will mean for Southeast Asia's future. And this state of tension between, opportunity and apprehension, attraction and fear is really the tension, that characterizes the relationship. This is the sort of the essence of the relationship. And of course, this tension is rising, every day as U.S.-China relations continue to deteriorate. So at a fundamental level, Southeast Asia's present relations with China are informed and shaped overwhelmingly by the reality of geographic proximity. The two nations dwell very close to each other. This has resulted in centuries of interactions between the two regions. They've been bound together by trade, by ties of tribute, by large-scale movements of human populations from one region to the other, and all of the cultural and technological diffusions that these movements of people have brought. And in fact, it's to speak of Southeast Asia and China is in many ways a very modern thing. For large parts of history, this line was very hazy. The southern Chinese province of Yunnan, once had much more in common with the Buddhist kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia than it did with the traditional heartland of the Chinese Empire in the Yellow River Valley. And the same was true of a lot of the southern Chinese who migrated to the region. They came from southern parts of China that were, only annexed by the empire very, very late, relatively late in the story of China. And, they had, it's only by a quirk of history, I suppose, that they are now within the People's Republic of China, and the Vietnamese remain outside. But the proximity this proximity remains the defining and unifying characteristic of relations between the two regions, and it's really they're really bound together like never before. So for China, proximity makes Southeast Asia a region of crucial importance, and one of the main reason is that we have to consider China's security dilemma. I mean, gazing out from Beijing, Asia looks like a very claustrophobic place. On every side, China is hemmed in by potential rivals, many of them nuclear states, and also including U.S. treaty allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, off its eastern coast. And so hemmed in by every side by powerful rivals, Southeast Asia is the one place where China doesn't face a entrenched great power. It is one place that it is able to break the chain of encirclement and sort of expand its power. And this became ever more pressing for the Chinese government by the 80s and 90s, when the Chinese economy was growing fueled by exports to the world's markets. China's need to gain access to those markets, both for its exports and to import vital resources like crude oil. This could have caused China's leaders to turn their attention toward securing these sea lanes, the vital sea lanes upon which its economy relied. And I think this is sort of, is the basic strategic concern of China's push into the South China Sea. I mean, they talk about historic rights and about traditional fishing grounds and all this sort of stuff. And there was a certain nationalist investment in these hunks of coral and submerged rock that have been the subject of so much tension as of late. But really, I think all of this exists downstream from this basic security dilemma. For Southeast Asia, China's proximity also looms, and this has always been a mixed blessing. As I mentioned, it's prompted a sort of a mix of opportunity and apprehension amongst many of the nations of the region. And in recent years, this proximity has only been increasing. In the mainland parts of Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, new infrastructure networks have broken through what used to be, and what for most of history was, a thick and impermeable barrier that once kept the Chinese state at arm's length. I've heard that it's possible to drive from Bangkok to Kunming in Yunnan if you drive recklessly enough within about 24 hours. And this is a journey that would have taken literally months for most of history. And so this network of highways, rail lines, and special economic zones, which are still surging ahead, has been accompanied by a transformative sweep of Chinese investment and immigration into the Mekong region. There's also the Chinese damming of the upper Mekong, which has given essentially Chinese dam engineers, the power of life and death basically over large swaths of the downstream Mekong nations. We see a similar collapsing of distance at sea, where China has broken with centuries of land-bound orientation and ventured out into the oceans, building up a world-class navy that's capable of establishing its control over these vital sea lanes. Historically, the oceans were an even more formidable barrier to the extension of Chinese state power than were the mountains of mainland Southeast Asia. While many Chinese traders roamed through the South China Sea and further afield, the Chinese state itself tended to disdain the oceans as a sort of realm of chaos and piracy that was not tameable by the usual imperial methods. It's given that most of the threats to the Chinese states came from the north and the east, from the steppe peoples like the Mongols. This tended to be where the Chinese focus was in terms of its security. But again, since the 1980s, this has changed. China's, embarked on a crash program of naval modernization that has, has seen it expand its power out into the South China Sea and potentially further afield. And as on the mainland, this has also been anchored by mammoth infrastructure projects. In this case, the dredging and construction of island fortresses on disputed specks of coral in the South China Sea. And this has collapsed the distance, again, that once separated nations like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia from the Chinese state. In some parts of the Spratly Islands, the Philippines and China are within 10 or 15 kilometers of each other now. So for all of the nations of Southeast Asia, China, its people, its money, its ideas, are closer than ever before. And this growing proximity, obviously, is a source of some concern in Southeast Asia. In a lot of places, it's reawakening memories of China's past actions in the region. Particularly, this includes the PRC's support for communist insurgencies during the Cold War and the vexed question of its relationship with the region's ethnic Chinese communities. A fear which in many ways predates the establishment of the PRC, but which the PRC is in some ways, not doing much to assuage. One problem that China's had, I think, in the region is the sort of imperious attitude that has accompanied its return to wealth and power, especially over the last decade or so. As a large power, China has a certain responsibility to assuage the concerns of the small powers that dwell in its neighborhood. But much Chinese behavior has done the opposite of that. China's rise and its return to superpower status has been accompanied by a sort of assumption that as the biggest, the most populous nation in the world and the dominant nation and economy in the region, that Southeast Asian states should defer to Chinese wishes. And in cases where they resist doing so, this tends to be put down to either ill intention or the malign influence of outside powers, for which read the United States. To a large extent, I think this is an example, a subset of the blindness and self-centeredness and solipsism that tends to affect all large powers. But I think it's also influenced by China's nature as a one-party authoritarian state. And one could even argue that there's a bit of a vestige or a residue of this sort of Middle Kingdom syndrome that predated the modern era, in which China was not only the most civilized nation in the world, but the very definition of civilization itself. And so this tendency has tended to make the current Chinese government awkward at engaging with Southeast Asian nations or any groups lying outside the remit of the state. Its officials have shown a keen ear for public opinion in most Southeast Asian nations and tend to be wooden and awkward in their efforts at public diplomacy. And even when they're effective, they're often undermined by attempts to influence Southeast Asian countries and shape political outcomes in ways supportive of Chinese interests. This has led to a general inability to respond effectively to the negative reactions that have been prompted by its rise, and even to the very idea that anyone could have a negative reaction to begin with. The general Chinese message to the region, to summarize it, I think, is one of flourishing within a Chinese orbit or languishing outside of it. In this category, I think we need to include the recent attempts by the PRC to broaden its outreach to the ethnic Chinese populations of Southeast Asia, which remains, I think, the most dangerous and potentially most combustible example of this official blindness of the Chinese state. In some countries, Thailand's a bit of an exception, but in other parts of Southeast Asia, ethnic Chinese have always maintained a precarious foothold in the national community. And China's increased outreach runs the risk of reawakening old fears about dual loyalties on the part of ethnic Chinese. Yet apart from all of these concerns about China that the region has, Southeast Asia has good reasons to maintain, a healthy relationship with China. In most ways, a prosperous and stable China is in the region's best interest. I think the Southeast Asian nations, have sort of subliminal memories of past periods of instability in China when the collapse of empires or, upheaval or the or civil wars often translated into destabilizing flows of people southward. The most recent example, of course, in 1949, when the Kuomintang armies fled across the border into Burma and then later into Thailand and created a huge amount of instability and quickly busied themselves in the narcotics trade and all sorts of other nefarious activities. And so, I think that there's an awareness that China's stability is in the region's best interest. And of course, I don't think there's any nation in the region that would prefer the China of Mao, which was actively engaged in stoking revolution in a bid to overthrow the governments of the region. So China's become a vital economic partner, if not the most prominent one, to every nation in the region. Chinese schemes like the Belt and Road Initiative, while they pose a host of risks and challenges, which we can talk about a bit further, they also have definite attractions, especially for poorer developing nations seeking to kickstart their economies and pull their populations out of poverty. And so for this reason, most of the region has chosen to participate in initiatives like the Belt and Road. I think they reckon that the risks of participation are outweighed by the benefits. And so all of these, economic interactions and the reality of geographic proximity make China something that the nations of Southeast Asia can't feasibly ignore or wish away. It also makes them reluctant to signing up to any American-led alliance or coalition of states that's aimed, either explicitly or otherwise, at containing China's power. There are other areas of important areas of shared interest between China and Southeast Asia as well. I think one of the most important, which is often overlooked in a lot of Western analysis, is the common anti-colonial political orientation that the two regions have. Both experienced the contusions and upheavals of encounter with Western imperial power and later with the Japanese Empire as well. And I think that these, this experience and the sort of lacerating self-reflection that it prompted, has inculcated a number of shared perceptions and interests. One of them, I think, is the most important, is this sort of, intense nationalism, which expresses itself in an extreme allergy to any hint of outside interference in a nation's affairs. It's inculcated a very strong belief in the importance of national sovereignty as an overriding norm of interstate relations. And so China's promotion of an international order based on this principle, instead of principles of, transnational principles of human rights, for instance, I think represents an important area of overlap with many of the Southeast Asian nations, even when China's own, imperial potential threatens to, provokes pushback in Southeast Asia. There is a certain degree of concord on this question. And so, for all of the reasons I've mentioned, Southeast Asia has a reason to be suspicious of the sudden hostile turn in American attitudes towards China and the way that this rivalry is beginning to develop. The research of this book coincided with a strikingly bipartisan and rapid souring of American perceptions of China that began shortly after Donald Trump entered office in 2017. And this new American consensus, anyone who reads a newspaper will be familiar with its main claims. But, it depicts China as a predatory power that bullies its neighbors, a nation that seeks to export an authoritarian political model to the world and uses debt traps in order to ensnare poor countries that take on too much debt. And the current U.S. administration has been particularly fond of framing the China challenge in categorical and starkly ideological terms as this sort of global struggle between freedom and authoritarianism. Of course, this image is often set against an idealized image of American primacy and the U.S.-led rules-based international order that China is allegedly working to overthrow. But I think that the depiction of U.S.-China competition as an all-or-nothing struggle between democracy and dictatorship has failed to gain much purchase in Southeast Asia. I think in certain quarters, and in here one might cite Prime Minister Hun Sen and some of his colleagues, there are memories of exactly what the forging of this liberal international order involved. And of course, this ordering in many places was a very bloody business. It involved, destruction of American intervention in Vietnam, carpet bombing of Laos and Cambodia, the U.S. support for autocrats across the region, and backing for the vicious anti-communist purges that took place in Indonesia in 1965 and 1966. More generally, I think Southeast Asian nations see no reason in principle why they can't enjoy fruitful economic ties with China alongside, robust security ties with the United States and other large powers, even when these powers are in disagreement amongst themselves. But all this puts the region in an uncertain liminal bind given the increasing tensions between the two superpowers. The lure and opportunity of China and the fear of its expanding power today exist in almost dialectical relationship, feeding back and forth into one another, and producing a deep and abiding ambivalence about China's rise. And as tensions with the United States escalate, this is placing additional strains on Southeast Asia's ability to maintain some degree of strategic autonomy. So in conclusion, the emergence of a more powerful, ambitious, and belligerent China poses probably the most serious foreign policy challenge that many of the Southeast Asian region has faced in a generation. Every nation faces in some ways the same challenge: how best to navigate and benefit from this new power's rise without compromising its sovereignty or succumbing to onerous Chinese demands. Within these broad parameters, each nation has met this challenge in different ways. Both within and between countries, there's a great deal of divergence in perceptions of China and in the responses that nations have taken in reaction to its rise. But now, with relations between China and the United States in freefall and competition becoming more heated, the challenge has become ever more acute and the balancing act trickier to maintain. Yet Southeast Asia has, for large parts of its history, been a crossroad of superpowers and empires. And in some senses, no region is better equipped in terms of its history and its strategic culture to bend with the wind and preserve its freedom of maneuver in a new age of superpower competition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Almost no need to read the book now, but I won't say that. I'll ask our other panelists to just come up and take their seats. In the meantime, Sebastian, congratulations on having a first-rate Skype background. You've arranged it very nicely. Not many people did as well as you.
I had a bare wall previously, so I've made an effort to up my game a little bit.
In terms of Skype backgrounds we had, it comes pretty high up the list. Just a reminder, the Sebastian's book, In the Dragon's Shadow by Yale Press, we actually had some copies on sale. I think they've probably sold out, but there will be... Are there more left? 2 left, okay. But there will be more coming in the next 2 weeks, and you can put your name down with the desk there where they were selling the book, and they will let you know when it comes in if you want to get a copy of it. It's a great read. Some beautiful phrases in there. I particularly enjoyed ASEAN binding the Chinese Gulliver with 1,000 multilateral threads. And the reference to the narcotization through summitry of diplomacy, a classic ASEAN tactic. Anyone who's spent a long time at an ASEAN summit will recognize the term narcotization, but it has its strengths. Let's introduce our other panelists tonight. First to speak tonight will be Sihasak Phuangketkeow, who's a former permanent secretary at the Foreign Ministry, had a very distinguished diplomatic career, been ambassador in Japan, had many other diplomatic posts, and is now currently a special advisor to the Eastern Economic Corridor project down in Rayong and Chonburi. And next to him is a very familiar friend of the club, Ajahn Titinan Pongsudarak, who's the director of the Institute for Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn's Faculty of Political Science. And related is our dear president, Gwen Robinson, veteran journalist, and also a senior fellow at Ajahn Titinan's ISIS institution as well. So all three of them will now be giving their views. I'm going to start with Kun Sihasak. Because of his vast experience in Thailand's diplomacy, he can perhaps give us now the perspective of a Southeast Asian country and what it has to be concerned with when it deals with China.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. And I want to congratulate Kun Sebastian for his book, which is very well written, well researched, and has lots of insights. Now,
Thank you.
I'm here not as a China expert. I'm here because I had the misfortune of working in the foreign ministry for some 40 years. And in a way, I've seen the rise of China. I remember the first time that I went to China was with Prime Minister Chachai Chunawan. I was still a very junior and very green diplomat at that time. And we arrived at night. And the highway, it's not a highway, it's a road, from the airport into town was 2-lane, and it was very, very dark. And we didn't have any choices as to where we want to stay, because all of us would have to stay at the Tiao Yu Tai guest house. I remember one thing about the Teoyutai guest house. First of all, they had good laundry service. Second, you didn't have much choice in terms of television program. But then in subsequent trips, I saw the change, the transformation. From the 2-lane road highway became a very 8-lane highway. And then you had more choices in terms of where you want to stay. And then if you went to Beijing, and then you went to Shanghai, and went Kunming, Chongqing, it all looked the same because it's full of skyscrapers. So that's the transformation that has taken place. And I agree with with what Kun Sebastian said, is that nowhere is China's rise more apparent than in Southeast Asia. So that was the initial point in his book that struck me. And I believe that Kun Sebastian's book is not about China. It's more than China. It's about the challenges that we in Southeast Asia face. And I see this as comprising 3 challenges. First, the challenge of navigating China's rise. China is the economic powerhouse in the region. We see China's rise in the South China Sea, and now we see China's rise in the Mekong River. And so that's the first challenge. The second challenge is navigating the growing geopolitical competition between China and the United States, especially in mainland Southeast Asia. And mainland Southeast Asia is becoming once again the arena for geopolitical competition as during the Cold War. And the third challenge, which is posed by the shift in the strategic balance of power, is a challenge to ASEAN's centrality, unity, and most importantly, our relevance. And so maybe let me begin with the first challenge, which is the challenge of the rise of China. I think Kun Sebastian noted in his presentation and in his book is that there is a tendency when we talk about the rise of China to engage in generalization. On one extreme, you have the narrative that it's a entirely peaceful rise. It's about creating a community of shared prosperity. It's about a win-win partnership. But on the other extreme, you have the narrative that China is the overarching threat. China is seeking to change the international order. China engages in predatory trade practices. But I think, having served in the foreign ministry, the reality is somewhere in between. But that reality is that China, because of its size, because of its geographical proximity to Southeast Asia, in fact, China is in the region and not outside the region. So that's the reality. And it's growing trade and investment with Southeast Asia. So China's influence is bound to rise. And when I was in the foreign ministry, we had many sessions about China, about how do we deal with China vis-a-vis the other major powers, United States. My comment would be that China is the reality that we have to live with, the reality that we have to deal with every day, day in and day out. Perhaps the United States maybe is not the reality that we have to deal with day in and day out, So I think the point that I wanted to make is that we have to deal with China with a sense of realism. And that means that we have to recognize that China's rise has brought immense benefits to the region in terms of economic growth, in terms of China's role in infrastructure development. But at the same time, China's rise has created vulnerabilities for each country. And so how to manage the benefits and vulnerability? And so it's really up to each country. And each country are faced with different circumstances. Now you have the BRI, you have the Lanchang Mekong, and that has helped to meet the development needs and infrastructure needs of many countries in the region. And we welcome that. But at the same time, we have to be concerned about the so-called debt trap. And also, as we see what has happened in Sri Lanka, what has happened in Laos right now, where there's report about Laos entering into sovereign default because of the high-speed train from Kunming to Vientiane. And of course, we also recall what happened in Phnom Penh 2013 at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, when for the first time we could not issue the joint communique of the ministerial meeting because we could not agree on the paragraphs concerning the South China Sea, because we all know the pressures on the Cambodians coming from the Chinese. I was there. We had to meet outside the conference room, all the foreign ministers in a small room, trying to work out the wording, but we could not agree. And so these are instances where we see the vulnerabilities that come with the rise of China. And it's mentioned in Kun Sebastian's book that each country approaches China differently, based on calculation of its natural interests, based on the specific circumstances of each country. Some countries are more dependent on China than others. Some countries are more cautious about China than others. Some countries are more wary about China's role than others. And some countries simply do not have the options compared to other countries. But I think whatever the case may be, every country is doing a lot of dancing. This is my friend Bilahari Kosikan. We were permanent secretary at the same time. He's the permanent secretary of the Singapore Foreign Ministry. He says every country in the face of China's rise, we're doing a lot of things. Dancing, doing a lot of footwork, and doing a lot of balancing, hedging. So each country, however it's dependent on China, wants to retain a degree of strategic autonomy. They will want to do that. And I think Sebastian has mentioned that. And ideally, we would like to have what we call the cake and eat it too, meaning we want the U.S. Security engagement. At the same time, we want to have robust economic engagement with China. But that's an ideal world. And so probably, we can't have that. And in the real world that we live in right now, more and more we are being forced to choose sides. But I know one thing, we cannot sit on the fence. Because if you sit on the fence, you're going to watch events go by and you have no part whatsoever in those events. And so we have to take side, I believe, from time to time, based on what we consider to be in our national interests or in the interests of ASEAN. And so that's the challenge that we face. But the concern that we have, when we talk about the geopolitical competition in the region, is the role of the United States. We know that we need the United States in the region. But sometimes, if you look back in history, Vietnam War, Cambodia, and then after that, well, we have some doubts about the sustainability and consistency of U.S. engagement and commitment to the region. Sometimes there's the ebbs and flows, and a lot depends on the domestic politics in the United States. What we really ask is that the United States should come up with a long-term strategic policy for ASEAN, and not simply see ASEAN in terms of how we fit into the global agenda, how we fit into the geopolitical competition between the United States and China right now. Even this U.S., the free and open Indo-Pacific, we welcome that. But what we don't want to do is to be part of the containment strategy against China. We would want the United States to have a more positive agenda. What we see right now is the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. version of the Indo-Pacific is not a positive agenda. We want to see an free and open Pacific strategy of the United States which offers countries in the region a positive agenda, meaning helping us to meet the development challenges, helping us in terms of infrastructure, helping us in terms of reducing the development gap within ASEAN. And for this reason, we welcome the recent initiative by the U.S. in upgrading its engagement in the region. The Lower Mekong Initiative has now been upgraded to the U.S.-Mekong Partnership. We see more money is being made available for infrastructure development in the region, and at the same time working with Japan, Korea, and Australia. And this comes to my final point. In the midst of the shift in the strategic landscape, what's important is that we have to maintain ASEAN's unity, centrality, and relevance. And under the weight of China's rise and the rivalry between China and U.S., ASEAN's unity and centrality is now under stresses and strain. And what is the real problem is that ASEAN speaks so much about ASEAN centrality, but we don't act on ASEAN centrality. And for us to act, we must be united. And if we don't act, we're not relevant. And the challenge here is that if you have the strategic landscape being the way it is right now, what the national interest and the regional interest of each country, but the perceptions of what is the national interest, what is the regional interest, are drifting apart. And more, many countries on mainland Southeast Asia, and this is my concern right now, especially with the Mekong region, is that more and more, many countries in mainland Southeast Asia are seeing their fortunes and future align with China than with the rest of ASEAN. And that, creates the fault lines between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia, which is going to weaken ASEAN over time. So somehow ASEAN will really have to get its act together in the midst of China's rise, geopolitical competition. How do we maintain our centrality? How we strike a balance between national and regional interests? How, if the South China Sea matters to ASEAN, at the same time the Mekong should also matter to ASEAN as a whole as well. So these are the points that I'd like to probably speak on at this initial stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sihasak. Ajahn Jay, well, over to you. Particularly with those points about, we're now, 3 years into the Indo-Pacific concepts. So it's really worth
coinciding with President Trump's tenure in office.
Indeed.
Good evening, everyone. I'll just say, first of all, to the author of the book that we're talking about, Sebastian, that this is a very good book. The sections that I've read, of course, the beginning, the end, but in between, certainly the Thailand part and different parts of the different countries. And I even have a blurb that I've made for you. And the author succeeded in writing a scholarly book that reads like an incisive, well-documented news analysis in different verses. So it's a very good book. And, it's a big challenge coming out this year because of the COVID pandemic. But it's very readable, it's well-documented. You've done a lot of research. And I want to pick up at the end of my contribution here about your last kind of dangling conclusion about the frosty Eastphalian peace. But if I forget, please remind me to use that as a kind of the last point to depart. I have just three clusters of points. First, we talk a lot about U.S., China, and BRI, FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, and the Ambassador Siasak also laid the groundwork for how to view the region. Mekong, South China Sea. I would say that this year has been a significant year. And by the way, Sebastian, there's one footnote I would just add. We have to call Burma Myanmar like the Myanmar call Myanmar. Otherwise, we'll never get over it. Mekong, South China Sea. This year, Vietnam, as the chair of ASEAN, has succeeded in making Mekong an ASEAN agenda item. Right before South China Sea was ASEAN agenda, but not the Mekong. But now I think Mekong now has been recognized as a kind of an ASEAN agenda item. And there's something similar in it. It has to do with water. On one hand, you have South China Sea. China's building islands, weaponized artificial islands in the sea, in the water. But in the mainland, you have the upstream dams that China has constructed, kind of monopolizing the water. So in different ways of looking at water, mainland water security, maritime, artificial islands, weaponized. So we're going back. If you look at Southeast Asia, ASEAN, one is a region, ASEAN is an organization. And, ASEAN has already been around 53 years, but in fact it has only been around 21 years. Right? The ASEAN 10 countries only came into being in 1999. So if you look at ASEAN as a regional organization, it has been constructed, with strategic regional autonomy in mind to keep the major powers out of the region, to allow for national development, and most important of all, to cool and resolve tensions and disputes between the two protagonists at the time, Malaysia and Indonesia. But ASEAN is unnatural. As an organization, it's unnatural. What is natural is this region, but even if this region, Southeast Asia is also a recent phenomenon. Before we had borders, before imperialism, the big power around here was China. So if you look at Southeast Asia, what is happening now is kind of traversing back in time. This is before borders and colonialism, imperialism became marked, and dichotomizing, dividing the region into the different countries. So we can also see, in this pitch, in this sweep, that what we're seeing, China as opposed to the European imperial powers or the Japanese, they're a different kind of a great power. China, we're not sure, we have to wait and see, but it's not looking to colonize as such. I think that maybe, there's a whole literature about what China wants, maybe kind of a resurrection, a revival of the old tributary system, perhaps. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, the belt overland is the old Silk Road in a way that was cut off, in the several centuries ago, and then the road in the sea corresponds to Zheng He's maritime expeditions, also several hundred years ago. So China is kind of reclaiming its lost glory, right? So in a sense, to me, the trajectory is it has a historical basis, and we have to bear that in mind. Now we talk about, I just want to pick up a couple of points about that Sebastian opened with, and that it has to do with proximity and prosperity. So proximity leads us to the neighborhood. So when you're close to China, in fact, if you're next door to China, you're going to have a lot of problems. Look at India, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, Taiwan, and Northeast Asia. Thailand is very lucky in this sense because we're very close to China with no direct border. And Sebastian mentioned about driving to Kunming. If you Google Map now, the drive to Kunming, it'll give you an estimate. There'll be a kind of a route that you can take. You cannot do that. You cannot Google Map going to Manila. You cannot Google Map going to Jakarta, which means that there's a kind of the combination or the amalgamation of this maritime Southeast Asia with mainland Southeast Asia into this organization called ASEAN. But now we're seeing the historical underpinnings kind of returning. So we're seeing a more distinctive mainland, and that is CLMTV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, and the maritime, which I call BIMPS, B-I-M-P-S, and that would be Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore. And these two regions, they're not divided as such, but on the map they'll be divided by the South China Sea. And mainland Southeast Asia is coming into its own as its own distinctive region, 250 million people, and with Buddhism as a main religion, not universal in the region, but predominantly. And then you have a GDP of almost $1 trillion and coming into its own in a way. So this is kind of, has always been a long time ago, a very integrated region in a way. If you look at the history of Burma back then, Siam, Laos, Lan Na and Lan Chang, Vietnam, there were Siamese in North Vietnam. And so before imperialism, the mainland Southeast Asia was kind of integrated. Labor market, people, movements, and so on. The maritime was also kind of connected in its own way. But it was always distinctive. And now I think that distinction, the distinctive characteristics, mainland maritime, are coming back into the fore, coming back to the fore. So that is proximity, seeing the mainland maritime as distinctive with historical underpinnings. And then the prosperity. So we've heard about prosperity, and then on the one hand, Sebastian mentioned that prosperity, the countries in the region, they rely on China. As a big, China is like the magnet, the vortex, the source of economic life in the years ahead, right? They're the biggest tourist market. We have very few tourists left because the Chinese are not here. And even though the traffic could still be very bad, even though without the tourists. But China is really the front and center now for prosperity in the region, and not just for mainland Southeast Asia, for entire ASEAN, but all over the region and even the world. So if you look at the security, however, countries have reservations and misgivings about China. In mainland Southeast Asia, in CLMTV, Ambassador Siasak mentioned about the Mekong region, contested upstream dams, a lot of leverage for China, and China has come up with its own game in town, own game in the region called the Lanchang Mekong Corporation, LMC, superseding, undermining, and subverting the existing first-generation Mekong Corporation under the Mekong River Commission, the Mekong Agreement, the Mekong Institute. So, China is doing in mainland and maritime a little bit very similar. Maritime, China is trying to, in the South China Sea, trying to come up with its own negotiations for its own version of the Code of Conduct, right? Code of Conduct for the South China Sea, a document to govern behavior in the South China Sea. In the Mekong region, it's gone further, and that is to come up with this LMC, and they just had even the latest summit of the LMC last month. So, when it comes to prosperity, security, countries in the region, they're looking for a hedge. So there's a bandwagon, there's a hedge, and there's a balance. So when I teach my students in the Thai way, there's a Thai saying for Thai diplomacy, you always เหยียบเรือสองแคม which means you always put your feet on two bows of the boat. Never one boat, right? And you kind of balance yourself. That would be balancing. if you just put your feet on the one boat, that is bandwagoning. If you put your feet in different boats and you kind of move your feet around, that's hedging. And these countries in the region constantly in the motion of hedging, bandwagoning, and hedging. And I think Cambodia and Laos, there would be one boat. Thailand, two more. I think it's in the Thai DNA, never have one boat. And then the other countries you can see for yourself. But the point is about the proximity, mainland maritime prosperity, counterbalanced by security. So if you look at security of these countries, they're looking at U.S., so the big rival of China in the South China Sea and maritime is United States, but also other countries in the Indo-Pacific. They have these Quad countries. The Quad is like the U.S., Australia, Japan, India, and then in mainland Southeast Asia, around here, I think that Japan is the main rival of China. So that would be my second cluster of points about the hedging, bandwagoning, and balancing, and also the prosperity, security, proximity, the Mekong, South China Sea, how China is trying to create its own game. It won't play by other people's game. And I think in the Mekong, they have a big advantage, a big advance. South China Sea is being negotiated. So we will see how that pans out. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about pandemic, COVID. We have pandemic after all. I think it matters. And I think after the pandemic, everyone suffers. China's Belt and Road is not going to be the same. I think it'll be scaled down a little bit. China is suffering too, even though it suffered first and it recovered faster. Right? So it's first in, first out, and it was able to use that performance for leverage, for political capital by this mass diplomacy, giving out a lot of mass early on in March, and now maybe a vaccine diplomacy, trying to come up with a vaccine and trying to promising countries. Even last month in the Mekong LMC summit, Premier Li Keqiang said, well, we're going to give you access to vaccine from China for the CLMTV countries. But this means that post-pandemic, eventually, the U.S., I think the U.S. it's got a lot of problems. I think it's a big mess. And it has really undermined and impeded the U.S. foreign policy projection. So I tell people who want to hear in Washington that their best bet is not to, they're trying to up their game. Ambassador Siyasak mentioned about the Mekong U.S. partnership, not just a Lower Mekong Initiative, LMI, but Mekong U.S. partnership, just announced last month as well, earlier this month. But it's not well resourced. It's not. It doesn't have a lot of resources behind it, and I think the U.S. will be grappling with this decline and a lot of dilemmas in the medium, longer term. So in the region now, we have China. Post-COVID, I think China will be best positioned, even though its clout may increase in a decreasing way. China will not be able to scale up the Belt and Road Initiative and the different corridors, including the CICPEC, China-Indochina Peninsula Economic Corridor here in mainland Southeast Asia, because it just doesn't have as much money. It also is suffering inside, it's in the economy, and then lack of global demand. So everyone is suffering. Maybe China will suffer a little bit less, and that allows China to leverage post-pandemic. And I think that we will have to see how they do it. But sometimes I think China is becoming its own enemy. There's been a lot of pushback against China. China is not winning friends during pandemic and before pandemic. And in the U.S.-China trade war and technology war, it's an open war. I call it a non-military war. It's hurting China. It's hurting China. So this worries me a little bit. And I'll just finish here, even though I have a lot more to say. I'll just finish here that this worries me a little bit because Sebastian talked about the last words of his postscript was that we're seeing in Southeast Asia-China relations a frosty, Eastphalian peace. I'm not sure, as opposed to the Cold War. A lot of people talk about Cold War. he says frosty Eastphalian peace. Eastphalian, Westphalian, there's a lot to talk about there, but frosty is becoming a hot war. So I worry about hot war. Hot war meaning that there might be an armed clash, especially if President Trump is re-elected. Even if Biden wins, U.S.-China relations will be on the rocks for a long time. I'll just leave it there, and then I think the points that we could talk about, and also in the book, about autocracy, democratization, how China is kind of more authoritarian governments in Southeast Asia, especially mainland Southeast Asia. But I have a little bit of a silver lining in the Milk Tea Alliance. I think in the long term, medium long term, democracy can still make a big comeback in the region. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jay. Like the optimistic last note. Fascinated also by your suggestion that ASEAN might diverge. It is kind of, in a way, it's an accidental Cold War creation, and in the that strain between the maritime and mainland Southeast Asia might begin to show. Gwen, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and good evening, Sebastian. And I'm very glad we could have you here, even though it's very late in Australia. So thanks.
You're actually bigger than everyone else because you're on the big screen.
Yeah, you're very big. Anyway, I do wear a number of hats, including as a journalist with the Nikkei Asian Review, and also a senior fellow at Dr. Titinan's ISIS Thailand. And so I thought that tonight I'm not stupid enough to go up against these two excellent veteran analysts on the academic level. I thought that what I could usefully do is perhaps speak with my journalistic hat on to evaluate and comment on Sebastian's book and his entire approach to what I think is really an exceptional book on Southeast Asia and the kind of trends and currents that he's highlighted in the book. And what really I felt made it special is his hybrid approach to research and writing. I've covered the region now on and off for 35 years as both a journalist and later in life some academic research, so I can particularly appreciate the difficulties in putting together a book like this. I worked with Sebastian quite a few times, I think, when he was a reporter, freelancer, and later as a commentator, and I came to admire his style, which always seems to mix colourful reportage and storytelling with really informed analysis and very thoughtful insights. So I think with this book, he has bridged the gap quite brilliantly between a kind of more scholarly analysis, historical research, and real gritty journalistic on-the-ground reportage to give us a first-hand look at the impact of China's rise on Southeast Asia and to examine first-hand the different ways countries of the region are responding and then conclude what it all means for the future balance of power in the Indo-Pacific to Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, and the blend between these different approaches makes this book, I think, a bit different from all the other books on China's rise in Asia, and we've seen plenty of those and even more this year. And I think also in the course of this first-hand reporting, and including actually in conversations with officials rather than just his analysis, what comes out are some important trends that I think escapes a lot of mainstream media coverage. I particularly admired the way that descriptions add the context of interviews and even the description of locations, which gives you a real feeling that you're actually there with some of these officials. I mean, like one of Cambodia's top trade negotiators is confiding to him in a fast food pizza restaurant in Phnom Penh, or a senior Lao official is speaking to him in a mildewed office building near a shuttered duty-free mall, and you're thinking, yeah, Laos is really it's really struggling there about his hopes for Chinese infrastructure. So these are the kind of colourful descriptions, I think, that add some kind of meat or at least colour to what you're reading. And it draws you in, and you hear about it from people themselves, how Boten, this once remote part of Laos, is transforming, not least because of the plans for a $6 billion high-speed railway, which is linking the capital Vientiane to the Chinese border and on to Kunming, the largest infrastructure project in Laos's history. So all this, I think, gives it a sweeping yet comprehensive tone and a literary fluidity that's hard to achieve for either academics or regular journalists. Bringing that all together is really, I think it's like the gold standard for journalists as well, which is to try and get that balance of reporting and analysis. One thing, though, that struck me is, and it's not really a criticism, but how some of the reporting, so it is your reporting of the people you speak to, but it does reinforce this impression that Asia is really, and particularly Southeast Asia, as both my fellow panellists have pointed out, is being forced to choose between the two great superpowers, China and the US, and to reassess what Sebastian calls Southeast Asia's anguished and complex relationship to China. On the other hand, of course, we get some close-up glimpses in the book of what I think is a surprising and underreported level of actual support for Chinese investment and assistance in this region, particularly in mainland Southeast Asia, and among both officials and business. So time and again, me too, I mean, I've been reporting around the region a lot, and in the last few years, I've heard both officials and business throughout the region, from Myanmar, Thailand and Cambodia, and to a lesser extent, other parts of Southeast Asia, not only express mild support for Belt and Road, but even praise it. And as I said, my fellow panellists have pointed out, the truth is that as much as Western officials and even some media would have us believe, the region is not solidly against BRI or Chinese investment, and as we now know, not against Chinese tourism. In fact, Thailand's aching to have it back. I think Sebastian summed it up well with quotes from a senior Cambodian official, the one in the pizza parlour, explaining why Belt and Road offered Cambodia such an attractively speedy way to upgrade their country, you know, improve electricity grids, transport networks, etc. The government welcomed support from any source, he explained, but it was China that moved quickly compared to all the traditional donors. And I'll just give a little quote. He says, the World Bank, the ADB, they'll take a year to send one or two guys to do a feasibility study. The Japanese will take God knows how long, and yet the need is here. So that sort of really, to me, summed up what really is a feeling that I think is underreported, particularly in American media or Western media. Of course, the downside of that, and the book's eloquent on this, are examples of unimpeded Sinofication, such as in the Cambodian port city of Sihanoukville, a once sleepy beach resort in the south of Cambodia, and, as I mentioned, Boten and its rapid development in Laos. So I think the book sets out effectively what we've all read about shoddy and hasty development, disregard for environment that we've seen throughout the region. And I personally also saw a lot of that in Myanmar as well as Cambodia and well beyond Southeast Asia, in Southeast Asia. So he quite rightly points out that even among like-minded powers like the US, Japan, India and Australia, there are important differences of opinion about how best to meet the China challenge. And this also extends to how best to deal with Southeast Asia. And I think he's right to point out how a country like Japan, which has been a big benefactor to Southeast Asia and is continuing and is probably being looked at as a possible challenger in some ways to China, and could possibly fill a void if we see the US turn more and more away from the region, is also very popular, partly because it makes few demands on issues such as human rights. It likes to get the job done. It doesn't fuss around too much. However, I think Japan's reputation is to take much more time and be more precise about its approach to development. And that could, I'm not saying that's a failing, but still China has the edge on that. I think I'd like to cut it short so we have time for some questions. So I'll just say that jumping, I think, to my point about, to reiterate Titinan's point about the COVID situation. Of course, through no fault but timing, obviously the big new dynamic now in Southeast Asia and the world is the impact of COVID and lockdown measures, economic hardships and things like tourism bans, of course in Thailand, but more broadly China and the broader region. And I know for a fact, because I did a read, that Sebastian was closing off the book just as it became apparent, I think was it in March that you were finalising it, how big the pandemic story was becoming. And I really sympathise because there is nothing worse than trying to finish a book and like the situation was just imploding and the ground must have been shifting from beneath your feet. But Sebastian managed to squeeze insights into the afterward up to, I think, was it April you cut off? I saw some reference to April.
Yeah, I think April or early May was when I did my final frenzied batch of changes and made my editor very upset. But it was good to make it I tried to make it as up to date as possible because at that point things were moving so quickly that it was really, and it was very easy to leap to conclusions about what it might all mean. And I just had to I tried to just take a few deep breaths and think through exactly what the implications would be.
Well, I think it was handled well in the afterward, and it really is something to get a book that's published in September that actually is referring to information in May. Quite unprecedented, I think, for a US academic publisher. So anyway, the point is that obviously the post-COVID situation is the big challenge, and so I'd like to think, Sebastian, that maybe that kind of sets some of the framework for your next book. So anyway, I think I'll close off there. And
thank you very much, Gwen. Wonderful summary. Right, Tam, our technical wizard, has popped a microphone up there that is there for anybody who has any questions they'd like to put. So think of your questions. I'm going to quite slip one into Sebastian right now, which has been on my mind, which is, Sebastian, your very persuasive critique of Western engagement with this region has been this idea of, sort of a values-based belief that somehow Western values are important, that hasn't been as pragmatic as it should have been, and not been as engaged with the realities. You could argue that President Trump's much more transactional approach and his sort of focus on basically what benefits he can get is a more realistic strategy. I mean, do you believe, your critique of particularly on Cambodia is very, very strong, but I think it applies in many other cases. If we all remember I was just talking to Sihazag about this, the aftermath of the Thai coup in 2014, and how every Western government immediately took the position of strong disapproval and then had to sort of reverse because the military government took longer than they expected and they were worried about their relations disintegrating. Do you feel that in a way there is something to President Trump's approach to this region, perhaps better executed, that would give the US a much better chance of staying engaged and being more persuasive for the countries here?
I think in theory, I do argue for a slightly more pragmatic approach towards the region, a better balance of values and interests. But the problem with the Trump administration is it's been deeply incoherent. I mean, on the one hand, you have Trump not only being transactional, but actively praising autocrats and dictators. There's a difference between engaging pragmatically and praising the methods used to repress the Uyghurs in China or to deal with the drug problem in the Philippines, as Trump is alleged to have done. And then on the other hand, you have the administration more broadly veiling this rivalry with China in this charged ideological language, a sort of the values, stuff taken to the absolute extreme. And so you have this very bizarre and volatile mix of transactionalism and extremely ideological rhetoric. And it's very difficult to know exactly what any of that means. obviously, American domestic politics is is in a state of upheaval at the moment with the election just on the horizon. In general, I the thing I argue against is not that values I argue that values should be a part of the mix with which Western countries engage. But I think there's a couple of things that need to be taken into consideration. Firstly, that those things expressed within a context of, established relations and trust are likely to have more of an effect. And the second thing is that it's often seen as a very highly sensitive question when Western leaders from countries that may have colonized countries in this region come along. Now, the leaders of these countries are often very self-interested in the way that they sort of use this anti-colonial rhetoric. But nonetheless, that's a reality of politics in this region. I think that one of the things I try to argue against, sort of between the lines, is this assumption that if we just stand on our values, then everything else will be fine. That we will effectively check China. And I think that if we could wave a magic wand and transform every nation in Southeast Asia into a consolidated liberal democracy with strong institutions, effective governance, trust in government, all of those good things, I think that you would probably see countries that are more resilient and able to hold the line against China. The problem is we don't have that magic wand. The journey towards democracy, liberal democracy, is a long and winding road, and it took us many years in our own countries to get to that state, and we're even seeing now how fragile that state has been. And so I think that it needs to be. It's something that should be part of the foreign policy mix, but I think it needs to be handled with a certain degree of care, rather than sort of just an assumption that this is the way that everybody sees things, and that because I think that there are the region wants support from the West, from the U.S., but it doesn't. It's not sort of. It's not looking for liberal prescriptions necessarily, and I think that we have to be patient. I think that unfortunately is a reality.
Thanks very much. Look, I'll take a couple of questions from the floor as some people lining up. Could you identify yourselves too, please? Peter Trainer, I'm a club member. Just have a general question for the panel and Sebastian. You've commented a lot about the political and economic power of China and how it influences the countries in the area. The biggest problem the world's facing right now is the pandemic, but there's also a lot of concern about climate change and global warming, and the clock's ticking on the impact that that's going to have on the world in general, on economics in particular. And I would the question is that because China is an authoritarian organization, an authoritarian government, they don't have to worry about environmental impact assessments or human resettlement assessments when they're looking at capital projects. They just do it, and they don't worry about the consequences. The consequences have an impact on global warming and on climate change, which eventually can get out of control. So the question to the panel and Sebastian is, will climate change and global warming have an impact on what China wants to do and what it can do in the area, that the natural response of the world, forest fires, droughts, floods, and so on, will they overtake the political impact that China's having, and will it make countries in the Southeast Asian area draw back from China's influence and say, we do need some measurement of environmental controls. We're not just going to rush ahead with the capital projects and the environmental project, the economic gains that we might get, and actually consider global warming and the impact on the whole area. And that's on the day, I think, when China has declared it's going to be carbon neutral by the year 2060, which is quite an interesting and ambitious target. Arguably, some would say that China's authoritarian model could be better for addressing climate change. I don't know if any of the panelists have a view on that, or whether it actually makes it worse because it's unaccountable.
I think it cuts both ways a little bit. I mean, you see that they can push through these projects without any concern about environmental impacts, but they can also push through environmentally friendly things without any of the, I think that the pandemic offers a very interesting point of parallel on this. I mean, you look at the way the Vietnamese have handled the pandemic. I mean, part of that, of course, is this very strong state that's able to just enforce lockdowns. But there's more to the story than that, I think. That the fact that the government was very quick in sort of getting out cheap testing kits, that there is a broad public trust in government when it comes to questions of, say, public health, that isn't there in a lot of Western countries, at least just not at the moment. And so I think that that's actually a really interesting point of comparison. I think that, the potential is there for these, not just authoritarian states, but countries that have strong states, that are well run, that have strong state capacity, to make progress on these issues. But of course, that is likely to come with costs as well in terms of the, and I think that I'm not a China expert, so I can't comment on how realistic Xi Jinping's targets are, how much of this is just about sending a certain message to the world, and how effective a lot of China's green policies actually are where the rubber hits the road. But I do think, to a certain extent, that cuts both ways, and it'll probably end up sort of equalizing. And it might end up just sort of reaching a point of equilibrium.
Perhaps the rest of the panel. I mean, I think there is this dilemma between accountability and, authoritarianism. Kunsi Hasak.
Well, I see the issues that were raised. I see it at two levels. China aspires to be for global leadership, and I've talked about this with some of my Chinese colleagues. Being a global leader comes with responsibilities. And at first, they would be saying, oh no, China is not at that stage yet. China is still a developing country. But that's in a way is a measure of global leadership on how you show responsibilities on these global issues. So I think it's important for China to show global leadership on these global issues like climate change and the other global issues. That's at the global level. But as far as the BRI is concerned, I think China is more concerned and more sensitive to the concerns that have been raised about the environmental impact of some of these projects, and the need for higher standards, the need for better governance, and also the need to multilateralize some of these projects. And like in the case of the EEC, the high-speed train project right now, China is working with Japan in terms of funding for the project. And I'm sure that the Chinese, they recognize that some of these BRI projects have been subject to a lot of criticism, and so they're trying to address the concerns, especially with regard to the environmental impact.
Thank you. Jay?
Thank you. It's a very good question. So the question is, if China's system, such as it is a kind of a single party, is state-led, market consistent, political economic system. And the question is on climate change, whether Southeast Asia will see this and then kind of pull back and then pull back from China's influence. And I think, now, if you look at the trend, first of all, the US is the one who pulled out of climate change, first of all, right? Trump administration, not China. And then I think this is the ultimate battleground. We talk about the Mekong region, we talk about the South China Sea, but the ultimate battleground in Southeast Asia is between the socio-political economic systems, whether China's model is superior to that of the Western varieties, whether you have a state-led government know best, right? Government knows best rather than markets know best. Authoritarian system. China did very well in pandemic handling for March. Vietnam did well, but also remember that Taiwan did very well. Japan, okay, South Korea, and even Thailand has been impressive on the COVID handling. So I think my answer would be that the jury is out. If you want to compare authoritarian democratic systems, I don't look to the West. I look at Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, even Singapore, vis-a-vis China. And then whether, Southeast Asia, which way it goes, and whether China's model is superior, so far, China has the upper hand at this time.
Thank you very much. Okay, next question, please.
Hello, I'm Andre, and I represent only myself. And I must say I very much appreciated this entire discussion today. I didn't read Sebastian's book, but my conclusion, as I hear all of you, is the lack of unity seems to be also the problem to counter the Chinese, we can say, invasion. And I pity your story, Ambassador Sitisak, about the poor ministers who cannot find a conclusion in the back room there at the end of the ASEAN discussion. It's quite sad to hear this. But Gwen, I must tell you, when you say yes, I pity that Cambodia and Laos, yes, definitely they needed the support and the quick support of Belt and Road. But there's also, you cannot deny, and there's been one Asian leader, Southeast Asian leader, who has put his foot, is Mahathir. He came back just for a short time, but he put his foot in the pressure of China to come with their own terms in the Belt and Road. And it's absolutely impossible to have the upper hand, I think, at the end, because it's built by Chinese, with Chinese management, Chinese employees, and the software they install is in Chinese, so later on, everything will be in the hands of China. And the debt will be forever. So this is a big problem, I think. And to put my question, I think there was one elephant in the room tonight in your discussion, except that Sebastian came with the name Xi Jinping, but we didn't say anything about him. I think the problem is, okay, China has been here since century and has been the power, but it's especially since the time that Xi Jinping is back that you see this extreme strength, and the rest of the world is, in Europe we are obsessed with Brexit, and the US are in a mess because there's some guy there who has been erratic, and in Asia we are divided. The problem is Xi Jinping has a free hand, and maybe what we could politely ask, because that's the only thing we are allowed to do, is what will China do about Mr. Xi Jinping staying there forever, which is really showing a very strong will. And what can we do about that? Because I think otherwise you could have your cake and eat it, Ambassador.
I'm conscious that none of our panelists are actually China experts, but I guess that's a very good elephant to bring up. Xi Jinping. What do we actually, Sebastian, from your research and any of the other panelists, what do we actually think his real agenda is? Is he as fearsome as he sometimes seems?
I mean, I'm not a China specialist, but one thing I will note is that the sort of toughening of China's foreign and international posture predated Xi Jinping. So there's a really good question to be asked about whether it is him driving this, or whether this is this is more of a whole of party sort of tendency. I mean, my own view about China is that it's basically its behavior and its ambitions are entirely predictable. I mean, it's a power that has ambitions. Like every large power, it wants to control the region around it. It wants to reclaim what it once had, which was, a position of of unquestioned primacy in East and Southeast Asia. And so I think that it wants, in some senses, what the United States has in the Western Hemisphere, which is a sphere of influence. And if you look at what the Americans did in the 19th century and the early 20th century in Latin America and the Caribbean, you see all the same forms of economic coercion, in that case, active military interventions, and all sorts of other, pressures that were brought to bear on that region to bring it sort of, to establish American hegemony there. And so, I tend to see it in structural terms more than in terms of personalities.
Jay?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Much of this preceded Xi Jinping. So another way to look at your question would be that, if Xi Jinping were not the president of China, President XYZ, somebody who came up in 2012, to what extent would we see this geostrategic projection known as Belt and Road Initiative and so on? And to a large extent, I think we will see it. It would not be called the Belt and Road, probably. It might be called something else. But the geostrategy of reclaiming that lost glory from the maritime expedition 600 years ago, that 1,000 years ago, the Silk Road, I think that geostrategic projection we will still see in a different shape, different form, under a different name, even if not Xi Jinping.
Thanks.
Can I just add here? Just very quickly, I appreciate that question, but I also think that maybe you should look at the fact that I don't think the whole Xi Jinping power projection, BRI, machoism is impenetrable. And as you yourself said, when Mahathir took, there was a fantastic renegotiation of that massive rail deal in Malaysia. Chinese were they backed down. The price was reduced by a massive amount, more than a third. Thailand itself has had many victories, I think, some of them small victories, including what was it? Is it ending the earlier agreement with China to blast rocks in the Mekong River? That had been going on for years. And I think also the Thais have played a very skillful game. And the point I didn't get to make in my talk when I closed it off was to say that I think there are some victories that we've seen right through the region following pushbacks in other parts of Asia against, the full reach of BRI. Does Xi Jinping himself personally, do you think he sits there in Beijing and says, okay, give Mahathir a discount? I don't know, but clearly he made the speech at the big BRI conference last year, indicating a much softer approach and a back down. So I think he's not all 100% bluster. I don't know what...
the Americans have this, what they call the manifest destiny, right? The Monroe Doctrine, manifest destiny. So you can think of Belt and Road, the projection, the geostrategic projection, irrespective of the leadership, as a kind of Chinese manifest destiny. And that implies the sense of entitlement. This is theirs to be reclaimed. And also implies a sense of inevitability. It will happen.
And also a sense of intense, it's driven by this sort of narrative of humiliation, which is that, we had this and it was taken from us. That's an even more powerful motivator, it's part of the mix. And that's, in one sense, what makes the current China a little bit dangerous, because that aggrieved nationalism can be very hard to sate.
Can see Hasak, yeah.
Well, of course, Xi Jinping has abandoned the policy of Deng Xiaoping, which is to lie low and wait for your time. And so I think under Xi Jinping, he believes that China's time has come. And it's about a sense of pride in what has been accomplished. And in the end, it's about the legitimacy of the Communist Party of China, because they don't have elections in China. So economic growth, continual economic growth, and a sense of strong nationalism is important to the legitimacy of the government and also the Communist Party of China.
And perhaps Deng Xiaoping would have been the same had he been ruling now rather than 30 years ago. Next question, Peter.
Peter Jansen, Asia Times. I'll try and keep it quick, brief, yeah? I'll go back to Jonathan's first question about U.S.-China relations. I think, to sum it up very quickly, what Obama had the TPP, which seemed to be a method of sort of excluding China from USA expansion here. Trump's approach seems to just be very kind of negative, just try to help Asia to prevent China from being a big force here. Let's be optimistic and assume Biden wins the election. I'd be interested in what the panelists and what Sebastian have to say. What would you advise Biden to do to strengthen the U.S. position in ASEAN vis-a-vis China? I mean, obviously, Biden is not going to go against the Trump. This seems to be a bipartisan anti-Chinese sentiment. But what could he do to be more pro-ASEAN and more productive in this region?
I think Kun Siesak made a good point earlier, which is that the U.S. has to listen to Southeast Asian countries and actually understand what they want and offer a vision of for the region and for the Indo-Pacific more broadly that takes that into account. I think one problem that has been a problem in American policy towards Southeast Asia for many years is that it's always been sort of downstream of a broader strategic vision or policy goal. And at the moment, that's this sort of rivalry with China. And I think China is in some senses, guilty of the same thing, as it's sort of obsessed with its rivalry with the United States, and it's missing a lot of the details that it's hampered China, I think, in many ways. But I would advise the Biden administration to, again, I think that there's a need to, establish a more consistent, level-headed, coherent approach to the region, to eschew, heated ideological rhetoric, and to invest in diplomacy. I mean, America's got military power. That's not going to change. But I think that under the Trump administration, the diplomatic representation in this region has been full of holes. There's been posts that have been sitting empty I think the ambassador to Singapore there hasn't been an ambassador in Singapore since the start of Trump's term, if I'm not mistaken. And so I think there needs to be, these things need to be revived. Now this, the Senate is to blame in some ways for not approving nominees, but I still think that, the State Department has been gutted under Trump, and I think that needs to be a focus, not just in Southeast Asia, but more broadly.
Any other advice for a possibly incoming President Biden? I see that Peter's nailed his colours to his chest.
Can I say so? Oh, sorry. Have you finished, Sebastian? May I?
Yes.
Just one thing I just wanted to say is I think that it's almost from another angle altogether, which is that Biden's in a very difficult place, peddling back from a kind of hard line on China, which Trump has kind of really set. But I think actually it wouldn't be as hard as some people might think, because the restrictions on US company technology exports to China, any country exporting now technology to China that includes any US technology is under sanctions or some sort of punishing regime. So I think that's a very unpopular policy amongst US big business, particularly tech, obviously, and it would be easy for Biden to pedal back from that. But more importantly, I think buying back into climate change agreement, the climate treaty, or some more liberalised trade agreements in Southeast Asia is not out of the question at all. And in fact, that is a very effective way to counter China, because at the moment, China has it right open as far as the trade agreement and the climate change, etc.
Jay.
Well, from what we can see, the Biden advisory team and their posture and positioning is looking to be like a Obama 2.0 in some ways, but it could end up being an Obama 0.5. One thing that Sebastian made in the book, of course, the point that Obama, engaging with ASEAN is showing up, first of all. So you have to show up. Obama only missed one time, I think, the East Asia Summit. But he showed up. And I think, Mr. Biden is a lot older. And he was the vice president at that time. And a lot of the Obama holdovers from the Obama time now are with Biden. So I wouldn't be surprised if they have a similar kind of projection and posture and position. But, Biden is no Obama. Obama had a lot of energy. He was very eloquent.
Rock star appeal, didn't he?
A lot of conviction appeal. And so, if somehow Biden falls short, I really blame the Democratic Party for not coming up with someone else that can beat Donald Trump. Now, if he does come through, then we would have to look at the teams, that he's come up with. And Obama, remember, he started off very strong. He was the first Pacific president. Big speeches, and he had a good team with the different diplomats and so on, Kurt Campbell and even Hillary Clinton, and he showed up, he got it, he grew up in the region partly. This is not going to be Biden. So the teams will be very important, but maybe he'll realize that he's much older, and therefore he delegates a lot more, he empowers a lot more people. That could also make up for it.
You can't really see Kamala Harris being a sort of stand-in, but maybe a lot will depend on his choice of Secretary of State in that. Look, I've got a question here from former Australian Ambassador James Wise, who can't be here, possibly is held apart by the rain. He's actually got a question which I think, Kunsiasak, you might be able to respond to, maybe Jay as well, which is, you referred particularly to the struggle to keep ASEAN united, and he's asked, to what extent does ASEAN's centrality, its unity and relevance in dealing with China depend on the leadership of its biggest member, Indonesia, which has been sort of absent?
Yes, I think that's the point that we haven't really talked about. Because if you look back in the history of ASEAN, the evolution of ASEAN, the fact that we were able to be united, one of the principal reasons was that of leadership. I remember in the case of Cambodia, Thailand was the frontline state. And being the frontline state, we needed ASEAN's political support in the UN. At the same time, we needed China's military support together with the United States. But there were concerns among some of the ASEAN countries that we were aligning ASEAN too closely with China at the expense of our long-term relationship with Vietnam. Because in the end, we needed regional reconciliation in Southeast Asia. But in the end, President Suharto decided that the Indonesians and ASEAN had to support Thailand as the frontline state. So at that time, you had Mahathir, you had Prem, who was also a strong leader, you had Lee Kuan Yew, and you had Suharto, and they saw the big picture. But you don't have that kind of situation right now where every country, more or less, is driven by national interests and they do not see the broader interest. Maybe because we don't have that kind of overarching threat anymore. So that's why. So it's going to be increasingly difficult because now you have China's rise. As I mentioned, many countries see their fortune and future tied to China more than ASEAN. So it depends on ASEAN making mainland issues, ASEAN issues as well, just like the South China Sea. But the problem of leadership, I think, is crucial to the centrality of ASEAN. And having attended many meetings, it's difficult to talk about the broader regional interest, because national interest and regional interest, the best way to pursue national interest is to promote regional interest. And sometimes this logic gets lost in the geopolitics of the present day.
I suppose also if you look at today's Indonesia, and Jokowi has some of the attributes of Suharto, and let's say Malaysia, both of them are dealing with much more complicated domestic politics that distract them, partly because they're more democratic, partly because of social media. Suharto and Mahathir didn't have those distractions. Yeah.
Mm.
Does anyone else have any other questions to ask? I see the floor is empty, the microphone is empty, so I think at this stage I will wrap up a very entertaining and educative evening. And thank you very much to all of our panelists and to Sebastian for bearing with us from Australia. And thank you all of you for coming and taking part.
Good night, Sebastian. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It was a real privilege.
Cheers. Thank you. Oh, thanks. Would you like?